his plans for the U.S. military and defense spending. Joining us now with more on this, Chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Jeb Hensarling. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Andrew. How are you?
I got to hand this over to my good friend Joe, who I know has a million questions for you, but I'll just...
I got it in the rundown. It's mine. I don't know, but with Greco, it seems like, I don't know, Congressman, Chairman Hensarling, how are you? It's good to see you.
I'm doing good, Joe. How are you?
I'm good. You don't want a border adjustment tax. How do you, but you think that something will get done for tax reform. You want it done, but you will not waver on the border adjustment, right?
Well, there are great economists on both sides of this issue, and as the old story goes, I got friends on one side of the issue, friends on the other side of the issue. I stand with my friends. I'm going to let Chairman Brady write this bill in the House and Ways and Means Committee. I have more than I can say grace over in trying to rid us of the scourge of Dodd-Frank. So what I do know is we're going to pass some type of fundamental tax reform program. It's going to be fair. It's going to be simpler. It's going to make us internationally competitive. Whether or not the border adjustment tax stays or goes, I don't know. That will ultimately impact how low the rates will be. But I think I'll let Chairman Brady complete his work.
So you figure, Congressman, and you've been around a while, you got to do repeal and replace, then you got to do this. Are you approaching this with trepidation, or you think this is something that is doable near term?
Well, no, I'm not approaching it with trepidation. Well, I've never worked harder and never enjoyed it more. I think we're going to get things done.
Something will get done near term.
Well, yeah, come on, the Congress just started. We have 2 years. I mean, obviously it's heavy lifting. That's one of the reasons you haven't had fundamental tax reform in a generation. But when the Senate's committed to it, the House is committed to it, the President is committed to it, nothing says economic growth quite like a fairer, flatter, simpler, more competitive tax code. It's going to get done. I mean, obviously there are differences that have to work out. I'm not going to sit here and say it's going to happen in the next 30 days or 60 days, but this Congress just got started. It's a 2-year Congress. Hopefully we'll get to it sooner as opposed to later. But not only do we need fundamental tax reform, we to have regulatory reform. I got to tell you, in the district I represent in Texas, which is urban, suburban, and rural, kind of all thrown into one, for every one complaint I hear about taxes, I probably hear about 10 about the regulatory burden. Right. So I'm certainly looking forward to the President addressing that tonight. I'm glad that he is taking us towards a regulatory budget, that for every new regulation, essentially 2 have to come off the books, because our small businesses are just drowning. They're just drowning in this regulatory burden.
Congressman, you just talked about the idea that you have 2 years to get this done. The President has talked about this getting done by August. Realistically, what do you think is more probable?
Oh, I'm not going to bet on the timetable. I think it can get done by August. There's a lot of moving pieces, but there's a whole lot more that we agree on that we don't agree on. And so I think it's a realistic target. I can't say for certainty that it'll be met, but I think it's a realistic target.
So much of the budget issue revolves around how much debt and how these things are going to be scored. Politically, in terms of what's palatable to you, depending on how it's scored, how much debt would you be willing to take on if you thought there was growth on the other side?
Well, I do believe in dynamic scoring, and so I want to see what the scores come out with. But again, every time that we have cut taxes, particularly capital gains taxes in America, we've had increased revenue. And so we know that there will be a huge revenue feedback component. But ultimately, the way that we're going to have to treat our debt is with fundamental entitlement reforms, and that is reforming current entitlement programs for future generations. I'm not sure we're going to see it in this particular budget, but ultimately that's what we have to do to get a hold of this structural debt, which, as we know, the debt has just almost doubled under President Obama, and I certainly hope that President Trump will avoid that. I certainly stand ready to help him do that. But ultimately, again, it's going to be modernizing health care programs. Frankly, Obamacare repeal and replace is part of entitlement reform. And so there we can get people better health care at a more reasonable cost and still begin to deal with the entitlement reforms that we need to deal with, ultimately to deal with the debt so that we don't become ultimately a backstop, bailed out, bankrupt society.
All right, so let's talk Dodd-Frank and what the, I mean, that's, I don't know where we place that in the priorities, but Is it going to be piecemeal? It's going to be the whole thing? And then I want to talk to you about Cordray and something I was reading yesterday. I mean, you can't fire a guy without cause. I hear maybe that there is cause. Do you think there's cause to fire Cordray at this point for some of the action that's already been taken? And do you think that's what the president will do? Are you urging him to do that?
You just gave me a lot to unpack here. First, in every conversation I've had with the president, the vice president, the speaker, dealing with Dodd-Frank is a this-year priority. Clearly, it comes behind Obamacare. Clearly, it comes behind tax reform. But in all the conversations I've had, it's a this-year priority. Second of all, I think there's a number of different ways, to quote our president, that you can do a number on Dodd-Frank to get our capital markets healthy and functioning again. One is through the Congressional Review Act. I mean, the president's very first Congressional Review Act that he signed into law was dealing with Dodd-Frank. Part of it's going to come through executive orders. Not unlike Obamacare, much of Dodd-Frank was done with pen and phone. Much of it can be undone with pen and phone. Through the reconciliation process, it takes a simple majority instead of a supermajority. Much of Dodd-Frank can be undone there. So I'm anxious to get it done, anxious to help the president, anxious to get the economy moving again.
What about Cordray? You expect him to serve out his term?
I don't know. Frankly, I've encouraged the president to fire him and fire him today. It's nothing personal against him.
Right.
But he is a national dictator for consumer financial products. That's got to end. The president ought to fire him with cause or without.
I know I ask you a lot. We got to go, though.